Good morning to everyone. So this is the fourth SANEM-World Bank North America Discussion Forum. And I thank once again World Bank for hosting this event. And so since 2017, actually, we have been doing this event, but we could not continue this event during the COVID. But thanks again to World Bank for taking up this initiative and collaborating with SANEM to have this, I would say, very unique event where all the young minds here in this room and some are also who are joining through Webex, they are in a common platform to share their ideas, views, and to debate on some of the very important development issues. So this is, I would say, I'm very much grateful to all the participants, paper presenters, and of course, the organizer, co-organizer World Bank. As you can see that the topic today is on shocks and development strategies towards a resilient South Asia, the broad theme. But under this broad theme, there are 8 sessions, and there are, I think, around 28 papers. It's a lot in a day, we know. But the whole idea was that to actually come here, share the ideas, and not just to stop the discussion here in this room, to take this discussion forward and engage with each of us, because I'm quite sure that many of us, we are meeting for the first time here, and we are actually building the network and new connections. So for that, I'd really request, as we mentioned in our earlier communication with all the paper presenters, to keep in mind the time, because we have to be very strict. We have the sessions to be finished on time. So each paper presenter kindly finish your presentation in 10 to 12 minutes. And then there will be 5 minutes of Q&As. So the chair in the session would definitely would have a big role to manage the time. But at the same time here, our colleagues from World Bank, they will also show some time limits, whether you have 5 minutes left or 3 minutes, or you have to stop. So those wordings will also be mentioned time to time. But just to end again, before I think we start with a very, I would say, a fabulous event. I'm looking forward to it whole day. When we are talking about these issues, especially the shocks and development strategies, and most of the papers are relevant to South Asia in this particular event. When we want to understand these issues, I think very important to understand the nature of the shocks and how we can build the resilience in the South Asian countries. Because the South Asian countries, they have common problems. So I'm very grateful that Dr. Hans Timmer, he will deliver the keynote speech, and definitely he will touch upon some of the important issues. But to me, there are 4 areas which are very important for building the resilience. One is, of course, in contrast to some of the past experiences in many of the South Asian countries, we need broad-based economic growth, not economic growth based on some very narrow-based strategies. Of course, current situation tells us that you need to follow prudent macroeconomic management, and there are various areas of macroeconomic management. We need to strengthen the social sector, health, education, social protection. These are very important. And very finally, which is very close to my heart, is that we need to strengthen the institutions. I'm quite sure that not many papers are actually very much explicitly focusing on institutions, but very implicitly many papers are actually touching on the very core issues of the institutions or political economy dynamics related to many of the development problems in South Asia. With this, again, I welcome you all, and I request Zoe from World Bank, because she has been, relentlessly, tirelessly helping me and SANEM for organizing this event, to give her welcome remarks. Zoe, please.
Thank you, Salim, and thank you so much for everyone's joining us today for this very special event. Sorry. I joined the World Bank post-COVID, so this is my first time helping to organize the SANEM-World Bank event. And I was really surprised by the quality, the diversity of the papers and the presenters. And thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. So I think Salim already summarized a lot of what's going to happen and the promises today. So I won't say much more. I just want to thank everyone, welcome, and also thank everyone from the South Asia Chief Economist Office who have really helped us, including all my colleagues here and Rana in the back, I think. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Hans Timmer, our Chief Economist, to give the welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Salem and Zoe, and welcome everybody to Washington. Welcome also everybody who is online. Welcome you to this conference with this very timely theme of shocks and development strategies towards a resilient South Asia. Many of you are PhD students or postdocs here in North America. And I hope that all of you will not only now, but will continue with your roots in South Asia, will continue to work on South Asia. And I hope actually that all of us will continue to do that because the region needs good economists. They need good economists to help learn the lessons from the responses to the recent shocks. They need economists to help cope with the crises that are still there in South Asia at the moment. And they also need help with designing and implementing a long-term development strategy. What I want to do at the beginning of this conference is to reflect a bit on this theme of shocks and longer-term development strategies, and just go over all the areas where challenges exist and more knowledge is needed. And I will end with what I think is an overarching challenge in South Asia, that when you don't address that overarching challenge, then there is little hope that you can solve all the other challenges that we will talk about today. So let me go over some of the shocks. First, the short term. And let's start with the COVID experience. I think we still need to learn more about the effectiveness of the lockdown in many countries. How effective was that? Because we have all seen that cities were closed, but at the same time domestic migrants were still traveling and went back to rural areas. We have seen that it was very difficult to protect the people in informal sectors that live from face-to-face interactions in their services sector. We have seen many countries that for a long time closed the schools, but how effective has that been? And we are all afraid now that many girls will have dropped out forever. And still, it couldn't prevent the Delta variant that was so deadly in the region. So lockdowns are still an area for analysis, including their economic impact. I think there's still study needed to understand the complete collapse of the healthcare system in South Asia during the Delta variant in many countries. Could that have been prevented? What happened actually at that time? Do we need more investments? Do we need different investments? I think internationally also, we have to rethink the vaccine strategy. There was this advanced market placements in high-income country that was very effective in creating very quickly the vaccines for COVID. But at the same time, the high-income countries were first in line and the developing countries had to wait. And so you have to rethink that strategy because ultimately immunity is a global public good and you need a global strategy for the vaccines. I think we have to study also more the economic responses to COVID, the support of people and the support of firms, the forbearance measures, the suspension of debt service by firms. What did that do to the financial sectors in South Asia? And especially, how large are the dangers for the countries that did not have a quick exit strategy? And Bangladesh comes to mind, and they never wanted to have an exit strategy because they felt comfortable with the ability to continue to support individual firms or banks. So a lot still to learn from the COVID response. On the commodity prices, South Asia was very vulnerable because all the countries are importers of net importers of commodities. Still, we know a lot, but still we have to understand better the impact on the balance of payments, the drivers of inflation, but also we often forget that the impact on real income. We calculated at some point that just the terms of trade losses meant that countries lost 3% of income on top of the decline in GDP. We have to study more the energy subsidies, and then we have to study how countries responded to the food crisis. And still, many countries, including India, but also other countries, they have export bans of grains in place, which for me is completely counterproductive. It is not only increasing the problems for neighboring countries, increasing the prices in regional markets, but the hope that you can keep your domestic prices low when the global prices are high is a fallacy, and ultimately also the domestic prices will go up. And you see now in India that those prices are going up. We still have to learn a lot about the macroeconomic crisis, and we are grappling with the crisis in Sri Lanka, the crisis in Pakistan, to some extent the crisis in Bangladesh also. Exchange rate policies are front and center in that discussion. Many countries, they have fixed exchange rates or managed floats, and there was a reason why countries try to protect the currency. If you have a lot of debt in foreign currencies in dollars, then you create more problems when you have a depreciation. But countries couldn't defend the currencies with the reserves. They ran out very quickly. And then you saw that countries ended up with all kinds of ad hoc measures, import bans, additional capital controls to try to control that. But also that was not effective. And in our latest South Asia economic focus, we have a spotlight on the analysis of the informal markets, the hundi, the Hawali markets, that are very effective in countries that also have a lot of remittances coming in, because then it is easy to create the exchange for those who want illegal capital flows or under-importing, under-invoicing their imports. We need to understand a lot more about debt restructuring, not only international, but also domestically. So a whole agenda, and we could spend all our time on these short-term problems. But then there is also the long-term agenda. How do you get South Asian countries more independent from fossil fuels, and especially independent from fossil fuel imports? How do you reverse the air pollution and the environmental degradation? How do you actually organize a long-term adaptation strategy for climate change that is real now in the region? How do you increase exports? We still are with that situation that South Asian countries are underperforming in goods exports, only 1/3 of what they should export. How do you learn from countries in East Asia? For example, Korea. In the 50s came out of a war, was among the poorest countries in the world, like many countries in South Asia. A resource-poor country, a densely populated country, very similar to countries in South Asia. Why did Korea did so much better? What can we learn from Vietnam in the last 15 years that had a phenomenal diversification of their exports? So that's a long-term question. But perhaps we shouldn't learn from the past. Perhaps we should think about new possibilities. We wrote in our reports about the opportunity of a services-led development in South Asia because of new developments with lots of arguments why services can take over the role that manufacturing used to play in lower and middle income countries. Perhaps we should learn more from the digital technologies instead of from past experiences. And then there is the issue of all the geopolitical shifts, the changing international division of labor. Also a big agenda. What I like so much about this theme of the conference today is that it brings together the short and the long run. And there are a lot of debates at the moment in the countries, but also in the World Bank on what actually the relation is and what the urgency at the moment is. And there are basically two schools here. One says that during short-term crises, there is just no time. There are no resources to focus on these long-term strategies. When your currency is in free fall, when you can't pay your import bills, when there is high inflation, why people are struggling to buy the necessary food, then you need to focus on relief efforts. You need to support balance of payments, restructuring. There's just no time to try to get the focus on these long-term issues. When your house is on fire, you call a fireman, and you don't call an architect to build you a new house. That's a very strong school of thought in the region at the moment. But then there is another school of thought, and that says, when you look back at history, then the really big course corrections. I'm coming back on a phone also. Yeah. The really big course corrections in developments or in growth strategy, they actually started during a major crisis. Never waste a good crisis. This is the moment that you can make major changes. That was true at a global level. And I mentioned it many times before, but think about the Great Depression. The world was never the same after that. Government policies were never the same. It used to be that governments would spend 6-7% of GDP. And after the 1930s, after the Second World War, it's very normal that a government spends 30-35% of GDP, completely a different role. As economists, we shifted paradigms. Suddenly we were thinking in Keynesian terms. After the oil crisis in the 1970s, after a period of inward-looking development in many parts of the world, people realized that that world couldn't cope with the sharp changes in relative prices, in the oil prices, and the world opened up and created global markets. In economics, we went back to neoclassical schools trying to understand how markets are working. In 2008, the global financial crisis, suddenly everybody started thinking about the negative impacts of globalization, the distributional impacts of globalization. You see a reversal of globalization. You see it also with crises in individual countries. For example, India in 1991, major balance of payment crisis. That was the moment that they completely shifted their development strategy away from the power in the Planning Commission to the power in the Finance Commission. I only have 1 minute, so I really have to shift quickly now to my last point that I want to make. So these two schools, they all have valid arguments. But I think for South Asia, there is one reason why you really have to connect the short and the long run. And that is, there is one structural challenge that influences both the short-term challenges and the long-term impediments for growth. And that is that in South Asia, you have an enormous underutilization of capacity. And we have written a lot about that. 80% of the people are still stuck in low productivity informal sectors. That's an underutilization of capacity. Between 20 and 25% of the women are participating in the labor force, an enormous underutilization of capacity. That has short-term consequences because all the fiscal problems that we're dealing with now, they are ultimately based on the fact that the tax revenue base is very, very narrow. That is because so few people are participating in the economy. When you think about the difficulty of adopting the shocks that we were talking about for people and for small firms, that difficulty is there because nobody has reserves. So few people are participating in the economy. And at the same time, that underutilization of resources, the fact that the economies are running on a very small part of society, and often a part that is a group of insiders that have protected themselves. That also is an impediment for long-term growth. So my final statement and my recommendation is that if you don't put front and center a more inclusive society, a more inclusive economy, where you increase productivity in the informal sector, when you make more people participate, when you increase the participation of women, it will be almost impossible to solve the short-term problems at the moment. You might do something on the fiscal challenges at the moment, but after a couple of years, countries will be back with the same fiscal problems. You will not be able to create the buffers to absorb the shocks that we will come in. And ultimately, you will not be able to achieve in the long run high income status if you are not much more inclusive than you are now. Thank you so much for listening. Good luck with the conference, and I'm looking very much forward to learning from you also. Bye.